All right, so what we're going to talk about now is taking a little bit of a look at measures of really kind of endurance exercise and what are some of the ways we can really determine how, I don't know, not how hard somebody is working, but a little bit more of how efficiently can they work, and therefore what is kind of their maximum. So one of the things we talked about with bioenergetics was the idea that there's a number of different ways to generate energy, and depending on time and intensity, which system is going to be used is going to differ a little bit, but we know at least a little bit more when it comes to endurance and longer lasting activities. And that is one of the things that I'm tailoring this course around, because it's something we can actually see is endurance activities. And with those ones, if you remember, most of the bioenergetics on that was of aerobic respiration. So one of the things we can look at is as a measure of how much work somebody is doing, or at least a measure of how much work they're capable of doing, we can look at how much oxygen that they take in can they actually consume, because we can make really good correlations between the amount of oxygen that's being used by those muscle cells and therefore how much ATP they can generate in those cells. And one of the things that we can kind of see on this one is there is a nice, at least to a point, a linear kind of relationship between oxygen consumption and work. They've done a lot of these before on bikes and using power meters. And with these power meters, you can measure the number of watts, and basically the more watts is the higher level of performance, more output. And what you can kind of see is there is a nice linear relationship. As the wattage goes up, so does the amount of oxygen that's being used by the body. But you can see it sooner or later, there is going to be some max level that the body is capable of bringing in. And this is going to be, as we see later on, a function of the cardiovascular system in terms of efficiency of the heart, efficiency of the hemoglobin, how it carries, how much it drops off, how much it stays in the blood. These are all things that are going to influence this. But you can see there is this peak. And what we kind of call this max of oxygen that we consume is what we refer to as the Vo2 Max. So when we get to a person's maximum amount of O2 consumption, that is their Vo2 Max. I will say, other years I would tried to put somebody on a treadmill and we could hook you up to a mask and actually measure your oxygen going in, the oxygen going out, the amount of carbon dioxide, and we could actually, it's a really nasty test to do because it's just a max output test. What you do on these ones is usually about a 20-minute test. You start the treadmill at a certain speed and have the elevation a little bit up, and then you just keep going faster every 2 to 3 minutes until the person basically says, I can't go anymore, and will jump off the treadmill. It's kind of one of those tests that makes you want to puke. When you get done, you're just taxed out. So that is reaching that Vo2 max. Again, not something that's fun to do. But this is pretty much that person's maximal oxygen consumption, and therefore it's going to be their maximal output performance too. It's really those amount of, at least aerobically, the max amount of ATP they can generate, and therefore the max amount of power and performance they can generate. Really what we're looking for when you're trying to test something for this is this curve of oxygen consumption to flatten out, and sooner or later you get to where, even though they're trying to work harder, no more oxygen is being consumed. Which means at that point they're no longer delivering oxygen, they're going anaerobic for that at those points. Again, really kind of difficult. And there's a number of things that are going to be involved in this too. But again, this is that maximal oxygen consumption. And it's, like I said, a number of factors go into it, but it's in reality delivering that oxygen to those muscles, and then the ability of those muscles to take that oxygen and the energy source and convert it to ATP. So it's a kind of a combination of muscles' oxidative capacity as well as the ability of the respiratory, the cardiovascular system to deliver that oxygen. And like I was saying, limits to this can be a number of different things. It can be the heart, so cardiac output, how much max heart rate, how much stroke volume you get. Again, these are things that, and we'll see later on, things that can be trained for. Obviously, if there's issues with your arteries and blockages or anything else like that, that could be an issue. amount of hemoglobin in your blood. If you're anemic and you don't have as much hemoglobin, that can be a problem because, again, it's going to limit the amount of oxygen you can deliver if you can't carry as much oxygen. How efficiently your muscles are perfused in terms of capillary density, how well the muscles are getting that blood flow to it, how much we're cutting off flow of blood to other areas. Because again, if you're sending blood there, you're not sending it to the muscles, and that again is going to limit the amount of oxygen being delivered to those muscles. Then it gets to also how well the muscles extract that oxygen, how good of exchange there is. We can also get into the muscle cells, how well they convert that oxygen to energy. Is it efficient? Is it not efficient? The amount of myoglobin, how many mitochondria, the size of your mitochondria. These are all things that are going to play a role there, as well as things in terms of ventilating. What's your lung capacity? How quickly can you breathe? Is there any other issues in terms of fibrosis or fluid in your lungs, anything else like that? There could be issues with that going there. So you can see a number of different systems in the body are going to play a role in the ability of the body to actually max out this oxygen consumption. And again, this is something we can see that really with training, this is something we can change. Again, we're going to see as we get into this a little bit more, a lot of this is genetic. There is certain limits. Certain people, they can train a lot. They will improve this, but you're not going to be an elite athlete if you don't have some of the genetics for it, is basically the simple thing I'm saying. You're not going to be an elite marathon runner if you don't have some of the genetics for that. Again, when we start, and that's one of the things I like to kind of talk about here and there in this class as well, is really when it comes down to it, with the amount of performance that's going on now and how well people are trained and other stuff like that, really you're getting a lot of times genetic outliers that are kind of these peak performers in different sports. So like when it comes to endurance exercise and some of these like Kipchoge and going sub 2 hour, even though he had some pacers and stuff like that in the marathon, there you could train as much as you want to. You're not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. So, but you can kind of see here, somebody that might be untrained is going to have generally a lower peak than somebody who is training over a period of time. You can improve this VO2 max. The other thing is you can improve performance without necessarily improving your VO2 max as well. There's other ways in terms of efficiency and other stuff like that to get faster, even if your VO2 isn't changing. And really, it's really the best indicator of how good your endurance is, your cardiorespiratory endurance. How efficiently can you get this oxygen and deliver it to the muscles? And that's going to be, again, looking at the blood, looking at the heart, looking at the respiratory system, and really looking at this. So during this prolonged physical activity, the greater your VO2 max is, generally the more you can work without fatigue before, or the higher level you can work without fatigue. So again, one of the kind of the gold standard, the best indicator of good cardiorespiratory endurance is that VO2 max. Again, it's not the begin all end all. There is other ways to get faster, to be a better endurance athlete without changing the VO2. But like I said, those folks that are going to be elite at this have some very high VO2 max kind of levels on them. And that's, again, just sometimes part of their genetics. And this is something I'm not, how we really express this is not something I'm going to really freak out about. I'm not going to have you calculating the VO2 max or anything else like that, but it is kind of one of these weird things. VO2 max is expressed in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute of exercise, which is a weird thing here. One of the things it does say, though, is generally your cardiovascular system is not going to be greatly affected a lot of times by your body weight. So it's one of those, if you have a particular VO2 max and you are able to shed 5 or 6 pounds, you're going to have less kilograms of body weight, generally you're still going to be able to deliver pretty close to the same levels of oxygen. So this is one of the ways a lot of times you can see this is it's generally those athletes that are going to have the highest ones here tend to have lean muscle mass type builds to them. Because again, the highest VO2 max is, it's going to be that delivery per body weight in an amount of time. Again, one of the easiest things to actually change on this one is that body weight level there. So it's 2.2 pounds per kilogram. It's one of those per kilogram of body weight. If you can reduce your body weight by 4 or 5 pounds, you're dropping a couple kilograms off of that. If your delivery capacity is about the same, your VO2 max will be higher. So as I was kind of saying, VO2, again, is the efficiency of the lungs, the heart, different things within the blood in terms of hemoglobin levels, red blood cell levels, along with the ability of the muscle system to take that and convert it to energy. Really what we're looking at here is the ability to do work or generate work over a particular period of time. Like I was saying, also in the other one there, relative to the body weight, VO2 max looks at the amount of oxygen that the body is converting to fuel. And again, if we're going to change that number, one of the easiest ways to change it is actually to change the weight. Again, a higher capacity to deliver this oxygen means more ATP generation for the muscles, which means we can maintain this exercise longer or at a higher level for a longer period of time. We're going to see that there is a lot of things that affect us, as I was already saying. Genetics is a big one. The other thing we kind of see in this one is kind of the thing always with age. Stuff gets worse. So heart gets less efficient. Lungs get less efficient. Because of this, we tend to see VO2 max levels decline with age. And the other thing is, again, with training, especially endurance training, long-term aerobic training, we can actually bring this up quite a bit. So an average VO2 max in somebody that's untrained is going to be around 40 in males, a little bit over that. That's at about a 30-year-old average. To give you an indication, my watch that I have kind of does a rough estimation. It's not a true one there, but it says I'm at about 54, 55 as a 43-year-old. So I'm a little bit above average on that one. When we look at the age charts in a minute, I'm actually pretty good off on that one. One of the things we generally see is in females, this does tend to be a little bit lower. It has to do with a couple of different things, just one of which women, because of estrogen and stuff like that, tend to have a slightly different body composition, slightly higher percentage of body fat. That is going to be one of the things. Like I said, lean muscle mass is one of the things that is going to lead to higher VO2 maxes. And again, not saying this is any fault of anybody or anything else like that, but the fact that estrogen has them maintain a slightly higher body fat percentage means overall that's going to drop that VO2 max a little bit. Other things along with this, especially during reproductive years with menstruation and loss of red blood cells, we are also going to have some changes in those delivery mechanisms that, again, a lot of times are not going to be able to be as efficient because there is red blood cells being lost each month with menses. Again, going to lead to slightly lower hemoglobin levels. And again, anything that drops that carrying capacity is going to affect the delivery capacity of this as well. So if you start looking at overall here, this is showing you where some standard levels are. So if you start looking at kind of some of these elite male marathoners and female marathoners, they're in the 60s and 70s. Generally around the 40 for someone around, I hate to call myself middle age, but someone around my age probably is going to generally have VO2 max in the 30s or 40s. Slightly higher if you're doing a lot of endurance training. Highest ones on record, and these might not be 100% accurate at this point. There's things that females were into the mid 70s. With males, the highest recorded one's been about 94 for that VO2 max. It was actually a cross-country skier. Cross-country skiers and Marathoners probably have some of the highest Vo2 max levels. Tends to be cross-country skiers tend to be some of the highest ones, honestly. I think it mainly has to do with the fact that they're getting the arm involvement too, so they get more efficient at delivering blood to more muscles, where when you look at runners and endurance runners, they're delivering blood mostly to the leg muscles, not as much to the upper body, so you don't consume quite as much oxygen, so those numbers tend to be just slightly lower. So some of these different marathon runners, like Prefontaine, Frank Shorter was a marathon back, what was that, 60s or 70s? Put an asterisk on Lance Armstrong. His was a little bit EPO boosted. So again, obviously anything that you can do performance enhancing drug wise that increases your carrying capacity or delivery capacity would affect this as well. Again, there's a couple different ways to do this. I mean, really the gold standard for measuring this is to do direct measurement of the air going into the body and the air being exhaled, and looking at oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations with a computer. We actually have the ability to do that in my A&P lab. We're not going to be doing it this semester because, again, I'm not going to strap somebody to a mask or have different people using a mask. With COVID going on right now, we're not going to go there. But that is one way to do it, is direct measurement. There is some other ways to do different kind of tests with running and other stuff like that, where you keep boosting people up, or a few other things there that you can do it with submaximal tests, looking at these steps and how quickly they go up. And there's definitely a number of different ways to kind of look at heart rate and other stuff like that to estimate it as well. But again, the best way to measure this is actually looking at inhaled and exhaled air, is the only way to do it 100% accurately. So again, Vo2 Max is kind of the gold standard. It is how much oxygen per body weight in a minute. A peak on anything is like that particular mode of exercise is going to be your Vo2 peak. Your Vo2 max is honestly the highest amount, regardless of mode of exercise, that you can actually deliver to the muscles. Again, generally this is going to be running on a treadmill, doing stairs, something along those lines. Sometimes cycling, but a little bit harder to get there on that one. Generally, when people are measuring this, they tend to try to have it measured in the mode of exercise that they're competing in, or the mode that they've been training in. Because again, specificity principle kind of says how you train is going to bring about the most adaptation. So if you're training running, you're probably going to see the highest Vo2 max running, not doing something with your arms, for example, like an arm ergometer. And again, it is a combination of that supply, that delivery. So it's using the cardiovascular system. Mainly Q is what we call this part here. Q is cardiac output. So the amount of blood you're pumping out there. And then what they really look at is the difference between the arterial and the venous content of the blood. One of the ways to measure that is looking at inhaled and exhaled air. And again, as we get into this more, we'll see a lot of our earlier training actually affects, so early changes to the body tends to affect this a lot more. Longer term changes tend to start affecting this a little bit more, so you get more efficient at actually extracting the oxygen out of the blood. Earlier on, you just get more effective at delivering it. Those are the kind of those 6 to 8 week changes, where a lot of the changes in the delivery, like not in the delivery, but in the actual extraction, they tend to be more 4 to 6 month training changes on that one. So delivery, again, it's really dealing with that cardiac output. So things that are going to be playing a role in this: how much blood you have, how efficient you are at returning that blood to the heart, so it's getting enough blood to pump out, how efficient the blood moves through there, so how much resistance do we have to blood flow. I mean, if you're going to extract more and you're going to deliver more, if you have more capillaries in your muscles, you can more efficiently deliver that, and that's all things that are going to help on that delivery end. Where the utilization is going to be a lot more of, do you have more of the tissue that is actually utilizing the oxygen? So again, lean muscle mass tends to use the oxygen when you're doing an exercise. So the more of that you have, the more you're going to extract out. And then within those cells, size and number of your mitochondria, how many oxidative enzymes do you have? So can you efficiently go through the electron transport chain and all the rest of that stuff more quickly, more efficiently? And then it finally also gets down to, is we'll see a little bit later on, there is different muscle fiber types. Some that are more efficient at doing, they don't generate as much power, but can do more aerobic type of stuff, those slower twitch fibers versus fast twitch, and a lot of that is genetic. We'll get into it. There is some ways you can kind of train some intermediate types, and over long periods of time you can convert some muscle fiber types, but a lot of that is genetic on that one. So again, probably the biggest influencer of Vo2 Max is genetically determined, but training, again, depending on training age and other stuff like that, you can improve this, sometimes up to 20% over your initial level. But again, a lot of that has to do with training age and other stuff like that. Somebody who's been training a little bit more, probably if they start a more tailored program, might see smaller changes. As I was saying before, males tend to have Vo2 maxes that are a little bit higher, and it's mainly the hemoglobin concentration, and it's kind of the muscle mass, that lean muscle mass differences here. Again, but women definitely can be very high on this and can, in a lot of ways, perform at very high levels. I know a lot of female runners that can kick my butt. So they definitely can compete at very high levels. Again, the direct measurement is doing a graded test, this stepping up this test over and over until you max out on here. And it's really, again, until the subject can't continue. I've done this with students before. I had people that were starting to gag when they were in the mask. So this is one of those ones, if you've never done it before, it can be a brutal test. It's not a fun one to do. It's one of those, you are basically doing endurance exercise for about 20 to 30 minutes, and you are slowly building up to going as hard as you can. And it's kind of like running a 5K full out or a 10K full out as hard as you can. When you get done, a lot of times you're nauseous and it's not fun. And again, a lot of this kicks in a lot of that anaerobic component at the end, but that's where we're going to get into stuff at the last little bit here, to how to determine that we know we've hit that max and not just that the person didn't want to suffer anymore. And that's the harder thing about a lot of these tests too. A lot of times you try to have people there cheering the person on the treadmill, so they'll push a little bit further. I know the one time I did the test in front of the class, I was doing a lactate threshold class. I probably did better because I didn't want to look like an idiot after talking about all this stuff and then not being able to keep going on the treadmill. So that's some of the stuff you have to pay attention to on these ones, is that you're getting to that max, and that's really some of the last stuff that we'll be looking at here. So we really got to get to the point where you're working hard enough that you need more oxygen than what you're consuming, and we're looking for that exhaled oxygen, or the inhaled oxygen versus the exhaled oxygen. We're looking for how much we're consuming to sooner or later kind of hit a peak of, here's how much we've consumed. So, and that's really what we're looking for on these ones. So in the next second half of this one, we'll talk about what makes one of these tests correct. And then what we're going to start doing is, then after this stuff here, we're going to start getting into what happens when you start doing an endurance exercise initially, and then if we do it over a period of time, how does the body change to get more efficient at it. So I'll see you next time.